Hey, I'm Alicia, your non-monogamous relationship coach. Welcome to the podcast where my friends and I chat about our relationships, enthusiastic non-monogamy, polyamory, swinging, kink, and our lives. You'll get a candid peek into what makes it worth it to live life outside the box. And in case you're still wondering, nope, we're not monogamous. Hello, hello, hello. If you are looking for a guide to help you navigate the pain of being vetoed or a breakup, then this episode is definitely for you. I'm chatting with Kyra Gilchrist, and she's a relationship anarchist and solo polyamory advocate. And today, Kyra's sharing with us how she coped with the aftermath of being vetoed from the relationship that she was in when she was last on the show on episode 9. And Kyra's describing how being vetoed can be a very traumatic experience and how she coped with it and the tools and skills that she learned working through it. And she describes for us what a difficult experience it can be and how it can take away your autonomy and choices in relationships. Kyra's sharing some really deep and powerful experiences and emotions that she has moved through and how she's moved through them. And I hope that you find this helpful and useful. And I found it really fascinating and just a really lovely share. If you enjoy this episode, please subscribe, like it, give us a review, share it with your friends. Anything you do would be wonderful, and I appreciate you. And if you would like more behind the scenes content, early releases of the episodes, go check out our Patreon, patreon.com/notmonogamous. Enjoy. Now I've got it. Yeah. So you were on episode 9 in August of 2021. And I think that is either my second most listened to episode or like the top listened to episode.
That's
so
crazy to me. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So I'm excited to have you on again and talk to you some more. Because
Thank
people
you.
like you.
Oh yeah. Thanks,
I mean,
guys.
I like you too.
Yeah, that's nice. That you're not just like hosting people, but you're
right.
You're like, so when is this podcast over?
No, I don't air those ones.
Okay, gotcha. Cutthroat.
That's fun. Yeah. So over a year ago, you were on the show, and a lot has changed since then.
A lot has changed.
I mean, in your life, I mean, a lot has changed in the world, but a lot has changed in your life. And I'm excited to talk to you and hear about how you've navigated all of the things.
Yeah. all of the healing things. Yeah, so a little over a year ago, I got vetoed out of a relationship that I was in for just a little bit over a year. And for those of you that don't know what a veto is, it's when your partner tells you that you have to end a relationship with someone else that you're seeing. Some people will refer to it as like couples privilege, hierarchy, polyamory, and that definitely fits it. Couples privilege is just inherent in some certain dynamics. Like when you're married, there's certain privileges and benefits that you have versus when you're just dating someone or you're single. So and there's a lot of it comes from the things that we believe makes monogamy special and so great, like the assumption that monogamy guarantees that you'll always have a partner by your side for events. You have someone to split finances with. Monogamy sometimes I think gives people a sense of security that their relationship won't end, and that's not necessarily true.
I mean, they all end eventually.
Yes. But it's why, you hear people shocked at like why our divorce rate is so high, because the Western standard is that, Western society loves to preach that, it was love at first sight and then happily ever after. And that's not necessarily true for everyone, or for honestly the majority of people. So
Yeah.
so I got a good taste of a veto for the first time a little over a year ago, and I will say it was pretty painful. I think it's I would rank it pretty high on the trauma scale. Some of the things that made it particularly difficult for me was that I was already in therapy rectifying like certain kinds of rejection and abandonment trauma that happened
Mm-hmm.
way prior to this. But for those of you that have had trauma happen before, you know that even if you've been working on trauma, if something reminds you of it or is kind of similar to things that you've experienced before, it kind of just reopens that wound all over again. And you definitely have a foundation to work with if you've already been in therapy and you've already been doing the work and working on it. So I wouldn't say that it's a free for all, but it can take you right back to some moments that, for me, it really felt like I was walking on the sidewalk and then fell into a black hole. Like, it was, I mean,
Oh,
is
yeah.
probably like the best way to describe it. And it took me right back to just those original woundings and pains, and the
Mm-hmm.
overwhelming depth of the emotions I experienced was really hard. It was really
Yeah.
difficult. Um, so yeah,
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about how I navigated that over the last year. It's been a little bit more than a year now, because when I had my experience of being vetoed, I took my time to look for resources to help me navigate
Mm-hmm.
it. And I know that everyone's experience isn't exactly the same, but just kind of an idea of where to start with the process. And
Yeah.
I found a couple of blogs, but nothing really substantial. And
There's not a lot, right?
I asked in local polyamory groups, what do you guys have? What are you guys looking at when you're dealing with this particular issue? And for those of you that are in like online social media polyamory groups, you hear about vetoes a lot. But there weren't a lot of resources helping you to navigate healing through
Mm-hmm.
one. So I am sharing what I did, hoping that it kind of gives people a point of reference and maybe
Yeah.
just a starting point. Hopefully some hope, and to encourage you to have some grace with yourself, because that journey is very long and very hard, but it is possible to walk. So yeah, so that's what I wanted to share today.
Yeah, I mean, any breakup is hard, but like because of some factor outside of your relationship, that's,
Yeah.
I feel like, even harder. And and the other thing I've noticed with vetoes is a lot of times people don't think that that's what it is, right? Like they think, well,
Yeah.
no, I'm choosing this relationship over that one because for whatever factors.
Yes.
Um, but that's really what it is.
I I did this thing that I do with a lot of things when I decided that I was going to jump into relationship anarchy and that it fit me really well, and solo polyamory. And I joined all these groups and I read all these blogs and I read these books and things like that. And I was kind of under the impression that um, people would acknowledge if they were vetoing you. And I
Oh,
was also under the impression that people would realize that that was what they were doing. And my experience did not quite mirror that. I'm pretty sure that to this day, the people that I was involved with would not say that I was vetoed. I
okay.
I think like um for those of us that really want to remove like couples privilege from polyamory and have no hierarchy in our polyamory, I think sometimes it can be very difficult for us to admit that it's just inherent in some of the structures. And
Mhm.
instead of pretending like it doesn't exist, which causes harm to the people who are subjected to it,
Yeah.
we really have to learn how to be able to identify it and then mitigate it where we can, but also just own it when it
Yeah.
happens. And so I had made an assumption that if I were ever vetoed, like the person vetoing me would be very clear, like I'm vetoing you. And what happened was kind of this really messy, like, well, it wasn't really because, it was
Uh-huh.
all these justifications. Um, and I learned, which I'd learned in life before, that healing comes from within yourself, and that just because someone can't admit to what they've done does not mean that you can't be a credible witness to your own experience, which I believe I mentioned in my last episode. You experience the things you experience, you own the things that happen to you and that happen to your body. And if you are going to die by someone else not validating your experience, then it is going to be very difficult for you to kind of grab the wheel and start that healing process.
Yeah.
So it became, for me, one of my first steps of healing was just saying that regardless of whatever people were not willing to admit, I trusted myself and I trusted the reality that I experienced, and I was going to move forward honoring and acknowledging the pain that I experienced.
Mm.
And that in itself is a pretty big first step.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I really struggled with that. I think especially when you're sitting across from someone that you really trusted for a long time and that you love deeply, and and you're sitting there thinking, like, why are you hurting me like this? Like,
Right.
it's I really trusted you. And they can't even own, like, what they're doing in that moment. And one of the things I really learned also is that usually meta problems are a hinge problem, right? Like,
Yeah.
technically I was
Yep.
vetoed by my partner, right? Because they're the ones that carried it out. And wrestling with that and coming to that realization that this person that you really trusted, because there's a lot of vulnerability in polyamory. If you're going to engage with it, you are letting go of a lot of ideas that you got used to in monogamy. And any relationship requires trust. But
Yeah.
there is a particular type of vulnerability if you are going to be dating someone and they're a hinge to someone else, like particularly to someone that they're married to, or a
Yeah.
nesting partner, an anchor partner. Um,
Yeah,
and
part of that trust is like trusting that that they have enough self-awareness to
yeah,
manage their emotions around all of their partners and around all of their partners' desires and fears and insecurities, and that they can like hold themselves steady through all the different people, right?
yeah, it is. I mean, it's a very intimate, scary place to be in sometimes.
Oof.
And I think that from my experience, I learned, moving on from it, I've learned what kind of hinges I'm looking to date. Like,
Mhm.
I have a better idea of the kind of person that would be great at navigating that space and would help me create our relationship to be a secure, safe home.
Yeah.
So it's yeah, it's been a little bit of a learning journey. But so when I got vetoed, like I mentioned before, it felt like I fell into a pretty deep hole. Felt like the rug got pulled right from underneath my feet. I will admit that I was pretty distraught, and I was
Yeah.
pretty distraught for a long time. I think a few things that contributed to that was, I'm huge about prioritizing my autonomy, and it was just
Mhm.
completely taken away from me in that moment. On something that was really important to me, something that
Yeah.
I held very dear to myself. I really did love this person, and now they're just gone. Like, they're super important. I'm involved with them. I have the option to talk to them and see them, and all of a sudden I just don't. And that was not something that I elected to do. That was a decision that was made outside of my relationship, and I had to experience the consequences of that decision that was made, whether I wanted them or not.
Yeah.
Um, Being a relationship anarchist and thinking that I was engaging with people who also adhered to those principles of respecting autonomy and things like that. And you kind of come to the realization that, everyone has their own pieces of trauma. I really look back at my situation and I feel like it's just three traumatized people kind of like interacting with each other and rubbing against
Mhm.
each other's trauma. And, I did the best that I could to use the tools I learned in therapy to navigate that. I can't say that I always did it perfectly. But when I did my rupture and repair episode, it was about learning how to manage and navigate the rupture that had happened in the particular situation that eventually led to me being vetoed. So um I will say that I was trying.
Yeah.
and it, and then like and that leads into like, polyamory is a quote unquote team sport. And relationships in general are a team sport, but there's more teammates in
Yeah.
polyamory. And coming to the realization that like you can do everything you possibly can, and you can even do it well and do it great. And sometimes it just doesn't come down to you. If you don't have the other people involved in your relationship doing the exact same thing, there's nothing you can do. Like you can't force people to stay with you. You can't force people to honor you. You can't force people to process things the way that you do. And to an extent, that really is the beauty of polyamory, right? Because you know that when your
Mhm.
partner is with you, it's because they're choosing you every single day. They wake up and they're with you. I think a lot of monogamous people struggle to understand that, right? That the only thing holding you together in a relationship is that that person chooses you. And for me, the pain of not feeling chosen in that moment,
Mm.
where someone else is picked over me and I don't feel chosen, I really struggled with not taking that action, what happened in that moment being vetoed, and not internalizing it as my self-worth and how much
Right.
I mattered. And that was really hard. I went to a pretty dark place. I want to say the first 2 weeks for me were the worst.
Yeah.
And I knew from previous pain and trauma that the best thing you can possibly do is to sit with your emotions and just let them happen and
Mhm.
experience them. You
Which is
obviously
so
should.
hard.
It is so much harder than it sounds, right? Just sit with your emotions. Um, I really had to sit with these really overwhelming, intense feelings. And I've been journaling, and I wrote down the things I was feeling when all of this was happening. And I don't know, it's kind of sad going back and reading like just
Mm.
some of my thoughts back then. So one of the things that I did do was I made sure to just write my thoughts down a
Yeah.
lot. And beyond the first 2 weeks, I did make sure that I was constantly writing down the things that I was thinking, because for me as a person, I'm a very external processor, and I have
Yeah.
found that if I do not find a way to release thoughts or
Get it
ideas,
out.
they will
Yep.
fester and they will
Yep.
grow into, they may go to places that they never really needed to go to, that can end up being very harmful for me.
Yeah.
So to protect and honor my own mental space and my own mental capacity, I wrote things down. And a lot of the things that I wrote down, especially in the beginning, were not very pretty. Like they were pretty negative just about myself. I really struggled with just, if someone that says they love me could do this to me, then what does that say about my value as a person? And I really I really struggled there. Some of the emotions that I wrote down that I was feeling at the time, denial was the first one on the list.
Mhm.
It happened so fast. I didn't have a precursor. From my perspective, there was an incident that had happened in my relationship that involved my meta, and then things were getting better and confident enough that I didn't really have concerns about it. And about 4.5 months later, all of a sudden, it is revealed to me that I've been vetoed the entire time, and that now it's hitting the breaking point. And um, you know, it for me, it came out of nowhere at the time, and I was really blindsided. I didn't actually know for that period of time that I was being vetoed. I knew that there was a really strained relationship between my meta and I, but I did not know to the extent of where it had really gone. And I didn't really get to know until there wasn't any time left to do anything about it, which I
Yeah.
think kind of added to my grief. That I would say when I grieve, I'm a person, I like to use my hands. I like to work through things. And I didn't have the opportunity to work on anything before. It was just kind of a decision that was made on my
Abrupt.
behalf. Yeah, and it was very abrupt. So the denial actually took longer to wear off than I expected it to. And I think it was just, I don't know, it happened so quickly. I just couldn't even. This person's in your life and you love them and you're close to them one day, and then the next day they're just gone. Like there is
Yeah.
no contact. There is no, like, I don't get to hear the sound of their voice anymore. I don't get to see them anymore. It's a lot to take in a very quick, like, I'm coming over and breaking up with you and this is why, kind of like conversation. So it, it's the denial took months, I would say, for me to
Mm-hmm.
finally come to terms with, like, they're not coming back. It
Right.
was the, like, oh, they'll change their mind.
They'll
They'll
figure
come
it
back.
out.
Yeah, exactly. And it took a while for that to sink
Yeah.
in. Anger was another one. And I will
Mm-hmm.
say that my anger definitely showed up in little bits and pieces. And I think sometimes I did sound angry, like talking about this with my therapist, but I had a lot of moments where my friends and my therapist would say things to me like, I feel like we're angrier than you are. I think for me, initially I just had a lot of sadness. Is
Yeah.
probably just like I had a lot of sadness. I really missed the person that I lost. I'm gonna try not to cry.
Mm.
But guilt. I had a lot of guilt and regret.
Oh.
I think so for me, I would not say from my perspective, because I can't speak for other people, but from my perspective, my meta relationship was always kind of on eggshells. And I think the guilt and the regret for me mostly came from, I knew that in order to keep that relationship for the length of time that I did, I was always dialing down my assertiveness in the presence of my meta. I was in some ways just kind of a doormat. Like comments would be
Mm.
made towards me and I never challenged them. Which is, and that was intentionally done on my end because there was always this impression that I had that if I did say something and my meta became upset about it, then a choice would have to be made between me or her. And I was
Right.
pretty sure that I was not going to be able to outlast just a relationship that someone had had for over a decade, right? It's kind of an unfair, it's kind of an unfair, unfair to pit the two of those together. And I wanted, I wanted the relationship that I had, and I was actively compromising myself. And I wasn't having my own back, and I wasn't standing up for myself, regardless of what it would have meant that I lost. And it took me a long time to finally acknowledge that I must have not lost much then. If I was harming myself to keep something, and keeping that thing required me to harm myself, then I really didn't have much to begin with. And I actually think, Alicia, that was something that you started a conversation with me because I called you so Alicia does one-on-one coaching sessions, and I did my first one with her, kind of when this initial incident happened. And I mean, I could barely talk when I first called you
Yeah.
because I was so upset. And we kind of just spent a moment to regulate and breathe together. And you had said to me, you're asking me all these questions, and we kind of get to the end of it, and you're like, and I can't remember exactly what you said, but the gist was like, if they aren't willing to honor you, then do you really have a relationship? Was kind of the mic drop at the end.
Okay.
And spending so much time with someone that you love, it's hard. It's so hard to acknowledge those like truths because they're good for you to acknowledge, but it costs you something. Like it costs you a certain amount of grieving and lamenting to accept
Yeah.
those things. And it was challenging for me, because I think having that session with you was the beginning of me acknowledging that I wanted this to be healthy, but this might not be healthy. And
Yeah.
I
Where
was
where are you
also still in a
compromising
place,
yourself?
yeah, I was still in a
Yeah.
place where I still wanted to try, right?
Yeah.
I wasn't really ready to give up quite yet. And yeah, no, away from that. So that's where my guilt and my regret went from. That it was kind of like I was a doormat to someone repeatedly, and then it's like, what did I get from it? Nothing.
Mm.
I compromised myself, and there was
So
no
many
gain.
lessons.
Yeah, so many lessons. Resentment was a pretty heavy one. Blindsided, which I mentioned earlier, shock, which both of those really went into the denial. I still loved the person
Mhm.
that had vetoed me, and it was one of the things that I tried to be really careful with, because I'd seen other people talk about this. It is really easy to, I think, get really angry at the meta who vetoed you. And
Yeah,
I
rather
think
than the
sometimes
person that you love.
yeah, I think sometimes people forget, like, there's a lot of accountability to be had by the person you were dating. And they were always the protective mechanism standing in between you and your meta. And if they choose not to assume that role, then like there was a certain amount of my partner leaving me vulnerable in that space, and
Mm.
not being able to acknowledge just the privilege that was at play, that really the playing field's unfair, like it's stacked against me. I'm the new person coming in, even though I've been there for a year. The relationship that I'm quote unquote pitted against is just decades longer than mine. So it's just it wasn't fair. And it's still it
Yeah.
wasn't fair. It was hard.
Yeah.
um Sadness, grief, lamenting, longing. I really missed the person
Mm.
that I had lost. I missed them a lot. And I will say that these emotions were really, really intense when when everything first comes down. These emotions come up and they're really intense. They were very overwhelming. I did sit with them. I was very intentional about that, but it was very hard, because
Yeah.
along with the emotions, the memories come pouring back in. And I had to get really good at giving my brain space to just remember and to process and to make sense of, like, how did we get here? So, for me, I look at it as your brain has to process through things and catch up, and then your heart has to process through things and catch up. And for me, it took a really big physical toll on my body. As well. So the first 2 weeks I cried so much that for 2 weeks straight, my face was like in constant pain, because
Yeah.
I was crying so much, my muscles and my face. It turns out you actually have a ton of muscles in your face. And they were so sore from me just
Yeah.
constantly crying. And I made a decision to let the tears come. I
Mhm.
cried as much as I could in appropriate spaces. And I let the tears come. And sometimes my brain would randomly remember things. Like I would get these intrusive memories of just things that I missed about my partner, or good
Mm.
times, or the hard ones was like just when things started going south, and wishing I could go back and redo like the choices that I made in those moments. And I let my brain remember those things. My personal tendency when those memories come up, they're painful. So my personal tendency is to want to stop them. And
Right.
I had learned from overcoming trauma before that you really just have to let them flow. You
Mhm.
have to really let the emotions and the memories be like a river, right? They come to you, they flow through you, and then they leave. But if you stop them, they have nowhere to go. So that means
They're just
that
gonna keep sticking around.
exactly, like they're festering somewhere. And I had kind of paid the consequence of stopping things up and letting them fester before. And I knew from experience that it's so much harder to work through things when you let them hide and fester up. So
Yeah.
I made a point, like wherever I was when those thoughts would come, to just let the memory like happen, and then In my mind, as that memory was passing by, I would say goodbye to it, like take a moment and honor it, because even though the ending is really painful, you were in the relationship for a reason. And I think it does a lot of good to have some sense of balance, to remember like you can honor those good moments that happened, and that the joy that you got from them in the moment. Yeah, sorry. And kind of let them move on and make space for other memories and other good things to come down the road. Um, so I did that. I sat with my emotions, and they were so overwhelming for the first couple of weeks that I will say that like sometimes I would come home from work, I wouldn't even turn on the lights in my apartment. I would take melatonin, I would go to sleep because I was so tired of sitting with like these overwhelming emotions. So you can
It's
always
physically draining.
yeah, and it's exhausting.
Yeah.
And you can always do short-term coping mechanisms. Now you can't stay on melatonin forever. But it's always okay to have short-term like coping mechanisms that are kind of just to get you through the moment. And they're kind of your lifesaver at that point, because at least for me, for something like this, it was really all consuming just for my emotional and my mental capacity for a while. It took a long time before my brain wasn't constantly like fixating on this one thing that had happened, and how do we make sense of this? Like, um, so the first thing was honestly just sitting with my emotions and feeling them, and learning how to hold this tension where when things end with a partner, oftentimes it gives us the space to begin to reconcile with the ways that your partner failed you while you were dating, things that maybe you were working on, or things that you had kind of like chosen to take as a compromise, right? Like, oh, this is probably going to be one thing in my relationship that's not going to fix itself. But when that person's gone, and especially like in a veto, like you have the opportunity, you get the space to kind of sit there and go back and think through all these things that weren't quite perfect, and you have to reconcile with the way that your partner was human and had flaws. And the tension in that is not allowing yourself to spiral to like phrases that aren't true, like they never loved me, things like that, while also holding the truth at the same time that the actions that they showed me were not loving, right?
Right.
Weren't loving towards me, weren't honoring, but their actions sometimes aren't blanket statements, like very, just
Yeah.
one way blanket statements. And that was really
It doesn't
difficult.
change the whole history of the relationship.
Yeah, it doesn't. And I'm gonna tell you that like that was really difficult for me to acknowledge in the beginning. I didn't really want to acknowledge that. In the beginning, I wanted to scream and cry, and I would have people that would say things like, you'll learn from this. And I cannot tell you how upsetting and maddening it was to have people say things like that to me, because I don't want to learn anything. I just want people to treat me right.
Yeah.
That's the space that I was in. I was like, there, for me, it's kind of like a senseless kind of pain, like from my perspective, because I'm shouldering um the grief and the lamenting. And that's not to say that, technically that my partner probably had to grieve and lament, and that may have looked a lot different for them. Um, After my veto, I found a couple of blogs that talked about being vetoed, and um, it was, and some of those blogs, they mention something that also drove me a little batty, that things will get better after you date the next person. And I know the face you're making. We both know this is and for me, I actually had no desire to date anyone. After that veto. I actually swung in the other direction and went a little extreme. And I had told a friend like I'm not dating anyone ever again. Like I'm done. I had gotten to a place where I had experienced relationships where I didn't feel chosen. And for me, this was like the epitome of that. From
Right.
my perspective, I'd spent an entire year pouring myself into a relationship and compromising myself for a relationship. And at the end, I wasn't even chosen. And I felt like I'd given so much. And um, I could not, in my pain, see things being better for me. So hearing someone say, well, this will all fix itself once you date the next person and they're fantastic and they're great and and then you can move on. For me, being in a space where I was like, well, I don't want to date. And also human beings are not objects.
Right.
It was one of the things that I struggled with after my veto was I felt like an object. I felt like I had been discarded, like someone used me as a toy and then they were done. And then they tossed me out because it was no longer convenient to work through the emotions that came with managing being a hinge or managing being in a polyamorous relationship. It was like as long as I was convenient, it was okay for me to be around. But the second things required a more effort. It was kind of like, oh, and that may not necessarily be true from the person that vetoed me. Like they may not feel like that was where their actions stemmed from. Um, and I did have to kind of sit with the fact that their behavior was not a reflection on me. It
Mhm.
was not a reflection of my worth. And it took me a long time, though. It took me a very long time to really internalize that. There was a point where I was kind of going back and forth, and I wasn't going to use someone else as my coping mechanism. I wasn't going to date another person. So and I didn't have any
Is
other
like your source of
partners.
validation and your source of self-worth rather than
Yes.
finding it inherently?
Yes. Yeah, I really did. I chose to go probably the harder route and just like I knew that like all of this stuff had to come from within me, right? Like I
Yeah.
mentioned before, like your healing really comes from within you, regardless of whether or not people validate like what happened.
Yeah.
Um, it really comes from within you. So I sat, I sat by myself and I felt the rage and the depression and the sadness and the grief, the lamenting, the longing, the love that I still had for that person. And um, I sat with the memories and I kind of made my way through them, and they were super overwhelming and hard. And I wrote down every thought that I had because I needed my thoughts to go somewhere. I was in therapy. I stayed in therapy, and I had already been in therapy, but all of my sessions suddenly start becoming about this one particular incident. And it was really helpful, I will say. It was really helpful to have someone that knew me for years and that had already walked me through navigating abandonment and
Mhm.
rejection, and for them to understand the context of what made this so extra tender for my heart,
Yeah.
and to have someone listen to me talk about my pain. And my therapist has done a fantastic job with that. Nothing was more satisfying than several months later, when my therapist had pointed out to me, she's like, when you come to your sessions, your face is a little brighter now. It was nice to have someone that could reflect back to me the progress that I was making, because I would say in the beginning, I was in such a dark place. It was very difficult for me to see I knew I was making steps to come out, but it was very difficult for me to see that it was successful and that it was working. So to have someone kind of guide me through it, so that way I didn't feel like I was completely alone. Um, Someone that was willing to be next to me doing that labor with me. It was really helpful to have that. Someone to ask me questions and to listen to
Mhm.
my grief and pain. Which brings me to one of my big tenets of healing from my veto was healing within community. And this idea for me started a long time ago when I was actually deconstructing. I was raised Christian, and I had to deconstruct that at a certain point. Um and that is where I kind of had this realization that you don't have to wait for this one monogamous love that you're isolated to, as far as emotional and mental intimacy, and physical intimacy. You can have a community of support and loving people that you already have, just friends. Like, your friends are so valuable. And I would say for me as a relationship anarchist, in some ways, my my friendships are more important than my romantic relationships because they are really a network of support. And so one of the things that I've learned before is that when you open yourself up publicly to talk about your grief, it also opens you up to receive support like back. So I made a point to be very vulnerable with people. I talked very publicly about like being vetoed and how I was feeling. And I made sure to give content warnings to people. You know, I want to be respectful that not everyone wants to sit in that dark space with me. Sometimes you just don't have the capacity to do that for people, and that's okay because everyone's dealing with their own stuff. And for the friends that I had that supported me and just had loving things to say to me, it was a great reminder that I am loved, because I think being in a veto, it's easy to walk away from that and say like, I'm not a lovable person, I'm not chosen. But then to open up publicly about my pain and have my friends look at me and say, well, we choose you. We choose you every single day. Like, we love you, we care for you. And having friends that tended to my emotional wounds in such a loving way, having that support, I think really for me was a big point of success. And I had, you know, different levels of support from different people. I did have kind of a core set of friends that, for me, being an external processor, were really helpful to have, because they were willing to listen to me talk and process and digest for months on end. You know, they were open to just listening, and they did a fantastic job at not forcing me to quote unquote learn from my experience right off the bat. They did a fantastic job at not dismissing my pain. They really sat with me in this dark place, and they held a lot of labor and a lot of space for me. And I would say that I think it would have been impossible to do what I did isolated by myself. I really leaned on having a therapist. I really, really leaned on having a friendship support network that, you know, people cared for me. And that was one of the things I made a point to do. I started getting intentional with spending my time with friends that I knew cared for me and I knew chose me all the time. And the more that I spent time around people that were investing the same kind of energy and effort into caring for me, the more it helped me internalize this idea that I am lovable and I am chosen, and that that person's actions has nothing to do with my self-worth. It says something maybe about their character or their bandwidth or whatever it is, or their capacity, but it doesn't say anything about me, the choices that they've made, right? And it helped me acknowledge that I was actually okay with a lot of the choices that I made, other than compromising myself. But I think that a lot of the steps that I took, I have no regrets in the way that I loved that person, and the things that I did to honor them while I was in a relationship with them. And it gave me the place to feel proud of some of the work that I did do that in that relationship, that was actually really helpful for me healing from other things that, you know, had nothing to do with that. It gave me the ability to practice asking for my needs and feeling a little bit more bold about saying like what's on my mind and what I need from my relationships. So there was
so important.
It is. Relationships don't function without you being able to vocalize those kinds of things. I think one of the like traps of monogamy is, in Western society, we have a tendency to feel like your partner should just be able to read your mind and just know whatever you want and know exactly how to make you feel loved. And that's not true. It's, you know, we're all human beings and we all have our own biases and our own perspectives, and we receive love in different ways that people do. We give love in different ways. We hear apologies different than the person next to us, right? There's so many variances. You have to be able to be open about what do you want, what do you need. And one of the things that I can say about that relationship that I lost was that I got to practice that all the time. I got to constantly practice like, well, this is what I need in this moment, and just learning how those needs felt within my body was a big one, because I think sometimes our emotions and our body gives us indicators like, hey, we're a little low on this and we need some extra of this. But learning learning how to listen to those feelings in my body and then turn it into a verbal request. Took a little bit of practice, but I got to do it a lot. So, I mean, that was something I was thankful for that relationship. It took me, again, months to get to a place where I could have some sense of gratitude for those kinds of things because everything else was so overwhelming. But I saw it as a marker of me making progress. It was one of those things that it was like, all of the overwhelming emotions you've been sitting with and all of the memories that you have been like letting speak to you and then honoring it and saying goodbye, it's working. Like, for a long time it just felt I was taking these steps and I was sitting with these hard things and it's like I don't see anything getting better.
What's the point?
Exactly.
Gee,
um
it sounds an awful lot like a grieving process.
yeah.
Mm.
um I remember maybe 3-4 months in, I go to my therapist and I'm like, so how long does this take? I'm still like in some ways kind of distraught and I still have intrusive memories and like my feelings sometimes still feel really big. And my therapist was like, it takes as long as it takes. Like there's no time limit on grief. And so sitting with the grief for a long, long time, I would say that I've gotten to a little bit over a year of grieving. And I would say that within the last maybe 2 months or so has probably been the first time that, like, people will ask me, how are you doing right now? And I'm like, I'm actually pretty good. I'm great. I feel good.
Yeah.
My mind does not obsess on this one incident that happened a year ago, like it did previously.
Yeah.
Um, and I will say that I feel like I did do such a great job with just listening to my feelings and letting them be heard. And now it doesn't feel like they're constantly screaming at me, like, hear me, like, validate me. And I would say, like, I don't, the intensity and sometimes it almost felt like obsessiveness
Mhm.
in those emotions. Um, I mean, a lot of that is pretty gone, if I'm honest with you.
Yeah.
I would say, and it might be a little bit longer than 2-3 months. I would say probably around August, I started just feeling better. Like it was easier for me to breathe and say, like, we've let that go because for several months I didn't want to move on from like
Yeah.
that person because
Mhm.
it was kind of like if I move on I lose them, right? Like I don't have anything other than memories right now.
Mhm.
So it was like its own grief to even like say like it's healthy for me to move on from this, but I don't really want to because once I do there's a finality to that of like
Yeah.
that door's closed. And it took a lot of work and it was just repeating the same things that I had been doing. But I would say that I've gotten to a place where I'm actually okay with that relationship being gone now. And I'm okay with admitting that it wasn't the healthiest relationship that I could have been in. I'm okay with admitting that there were good parts to it. Like there was a reason why I dated that person and that I loved them and that love grew. Um, and I'm okay with at this point I'm okay with moving on and saying like I may never see or talk to this person again, but I remember what happened, the good stuff, the stuff that wasn't so great. I've taken from that relationship the things that I've needed to learn. Once I had the capacity to learn from learn from my mistakes, I sat with those things and I learned from them. And I'm okay with what I have now. Like
Yeah.
it has been a long time coming, but I'm okay with what I have left from that. And I'm okay with like closing the door on that completely. So it took a long time, way
Yeah.
longer than I think I anticipated. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But what a really what a wonderful thing for people to hear though, that like there's hope and there's it
Yeah,
shifts and it changes and you
it
come out the
does.
other side and when it feels like it's never going to end, it actually does start to end.
Yeah, there is I I think like I rolled my eyes at it when like the veto was really fresh. But yes, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. You kind of just really, you just have to take one step. If you just take one step and then later you take another step, and then eventually you take another one, and then eventually you take another one. And sometimes there's not a time limit on when you take those steps or how big they are. They can be really tiny steps in the beginning. They don't have to be massive. Don't require more of yourself. Like, don't give so much of yourself that it doesn't lead to conducive healing. So for instance, if you are a physical pain trauma victim and you land in the ICU, no one is coming up to you and handing you a textbook about your wounds and telling you to learn like learn about your wounds or anything like that. They give you space to actually physically heal, right? We stop the bleeding, like we put you on medicine, pain medicine, like we begin to manage symptoms, and you can get to the root of it later. What's
Yep.
important right now is triage, right? We want to stop the bleeding, we want to close up the hole. It's I think that people don't realize like you should take care of those traumatic events, like you should take care of them like a gunshot wound, right? Like
Yeah.
you really need to like give them the space to heal, the time to heal, and you can learn from it later.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's no pressure to do
Yeah.
that
Plenty
right
of
off
time
the
for
bat.
that.
I mentioned earlier, I grieve with my hands. So I just knowing myself from previous grieving instances, I know that I grieve really well when I have something to do with my hands. So, I did take like a box and I made a memory box of just all of the memories that I had of this person, pictures, and I wrote down things that I remembered about our relationship that I didn't want to forget. I bought little like trinkets that symbolized certain things from our relationship, and I put it in there. And I wrote quotes on it on the outside of the box, just things that this person had said to me that meant a lot at the time.
Yeah.
And so it was, for me, it was kind of like having a funeral, like
Mm-hmm.
just being able to honor my grief and to do something about it in that moment, because you'll learn really quickly in a veto that you actually can't control everything that happens to you. So um focusing on what you can control, which is your response to the veto and the
Yeah.
grief. I really had to hone in on that, because it was really easy for me to get distracted with, well, these people did me wrong. And, it was easy for my brain to want to get obsessive about like how can we fix that? And the reality
Right.
is I can't fix what happened to me, but I can heal. Like I can own that healing, and I can own that grief, and I can validate myself, and I can listen to my emotions, and I can remember things. And one of those things for me was taking a box and making a memory box and honoring the things that felt good about that relationship. And every so often, when I would have a really hard moment and I would miss this person, I would go through the box and I would just remember things and give space to honor it. Where I knew that things were getting better was probably the summer, when I would start to open up the box, and it would make me really angry that this person treated me this way.
Yeah.
Because like before that, I had such love for them, and I was so sad and I was so hurt, and I wanted them to come back. And I hadn't quite fully internalized just the way that that person didn't hold me with respect and with honor. And the more that I processed and the more that I sat with things, the more that that became apparent, the more my brain was ready to just accept that reality. And it got to a point where I would open the box, and the thoughts that would come to my mind was like, this relationship was not enough for me, like this relationship wasn't good for me. And I'm not saying that out of a malicious place. I'm saying that in a very like, okay, it's time that we like acknowledge that this wasn't the healthiest situation that we could have been in. And it felt okay for me to close the lid on the box and then really not to open it again. Like I
Mm-hmm.
didn't really need to open the box and go through it again, while simultaneously saying, yeah, it was good and I honor that in some ways. But also like, we're learning now, like when we meet future partners, we don't want to make the same mistakes. So
Yeah, and
um
what a beautiful way to create closure for yourself when
yeah,
these other people aren't available for that.
yeah, I yeah that became kind of a big point. You do, at least in my situation, you do kind of have to create your own closure.
Yeah.
it would have been nice if there was accountability and people would own the things that they had said and that they had done, and the way that it just had impacted me so deeply, and I had to create that for myself
Yep.
because sometimes people really don't have the emotional capacity to do the things that you want them and need them to do. And it got to a point where it was kind of like, well, I'm not stalling my own emotional health, like waiting for someone to do something that they may never, like, the reality is they may never have the emotional capacity to do what I need them to do in that moment. So, and I actually remember that being a big point of anger for me. I was so angry that they had given me all this work. Like, I had to heal through all of this stuff. And it wasn't even like my fault. You know,
Right.
at least I looked at it that way. I will say that that phrase, saying that it's not my fault, that's a little nuanced because in hindsight, there are times that I should have released that relationship before that veto happened. Like
Mm.
times that I had to compromise myself and be a doormat and be the scapegoat. And the person that I was engaged with really firmly believed that I was the person that was keeping their marriage healthy or unhealthy. And it's, and we know, right? That's not actually my responsibility.
Nope.
That's on the people that are in that relationship. But when you get into polyamory, it really can shine a pretty big light on things that may not be super great. And some dynamics that you have, it can expose cracks and it can expose like emotions that you don't know how to process, like jealousy. It shines a big light on things that need to kind of be repaired. And I can imagine that it's really easy, just like I had to process denial from my veto. I think if I'm in a monogamous marriage, or not a monogamous marriage, but just a marriage, and I think it can be really easy sometimes to fall back on these ideas that come from monogamy, and then the quote unquote last person in becomes the default scapegoat, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
well,
Mm-hmm.
we're not ready to admit that these problems come from us, so
Yep.
you're kind of the easy person to
Everything
blame.
everything was fine before we met
Exactly.
you, and
Right.
we didn't have to deal with another human and their
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
emotions and our emotions about them. We didn't have to deal with that, so clearly it's your fault.
Yeah, that was there. um uh so I think like being able to honor myself and saying that like I know what I experience, I know I know the reality of it, and I have to create the closure for myself, and then honoring the anger that came with that, right? Like I really was. It really bothered me that they kind of, for me at the time, it felt like they came into my life just like trashed my inner room,
Yeah.
and then just whisked off, and nothing infuriated me more than the thought that like they had broke me in such an intimate way, but they had each other. Like leaving from that, like they did that together and then they left together. And it felt, it was it for me it felt like a particular kind of just like maliciousness in that pain, which I don't
Mm.
think that they were awake at night like we're going to mess up this person's inner, like, in our life, and their emotional well-being. I don't think that it was calculated. I think that they were preserving themselves, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the anger for me came from like, well, you should be able to acknowledge that, like you should be able to see that in preserving yourself you're trampling on me. And I have been able to resolve that anger, and coming from it, like I would say humans are very funny. Like, humans, like really, if there's one thing that I think humans have as a primal instinct, it's to protect themselves, right? And um I think that there's enough tools available to those of us that are participating in relationships that aren't even necessarily non-monogamous, but in any relationship structure, I think there's a lot of tools available for us to learn how to not use self-preservation at the cost of someone else's emotional well-being
Mm.
or someone else's physical well-being. And if you're going to engage in non-monogamy, you definitely are going, like if you're going to be a hinge, you have to learn, and you have to learn how to navigate that. find your sense of safety within yourself and honor it, and learn how to like just process the hard emotions. It's,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
yeah, so I've got my memory box. I don't need it as much anymore, like as a coping mechanism. It There was a moment where when I first made it, it sat on my kitchen counter where I could see it every day. And another marker of progress for me was when I told my therapist that I felt actually good about taking it and putting it on a shelf somewhere, and I didn't need to see it all the time. Um and now I don't, it's been a very long, it's been months since I've had to go pick up the box and kind of look through it. And I have gotten better at accepting the reality of the relationship as it was. And
Hmm.
so
So good.
um
Have you
I
decided to start dating again? I
I
know that's what
actually
everyone wants to
have.
know.
Yeah, I know. I have. It took me a long time. It took me a while. And
Yeah.
some of that was me trying to protect myself, right? Like I
Yeah.
just didn't want to end up in the same situation again. When I did realize, like, okay, like, I did the whole I'm gonna be a nun and just a non-monogamous nun. We're going to a nunnery and we're shunning romantic relationships forever. When I realized that wasn't going to work forever, um, it I made a very intentional move that I did not want to make the next person I date to pay for the
Yeah.
things that had happened to me. And there's this thing that sometimes you'll hear people say that you have to be completely healed before going into another relationship. I don't know a single person that I don't know a single person that is 100% healed before going into another relationship. But I felt like I had resolved enough within myself that the temptation to use that person as my form of vengeance was
Right.
not like an alluring temptation. Like, it was just not something I wanted to do.
Right.
Me dating again was about me being in a relationship that I wanted to be in, that was healthy and
Hmm.
life-giving. And so I actually have found that with someone. Um,
Yay.
and I will say that I'm really thankful for the work I did, honestly,
Yeah.
before getting into that relationship. I think it's helped me focus on building the foundation to that relationship instead of trying to fix what happened to me in the past. And
Mm-hmm.
so I feel the forward momentum with that dynamic. And yeah, I did ask better questions this time. Was interested in this person. The person that I had been vetoed from dating, I took a long time getting to know them, for like a very long time. I would say about a year, maybe even more than that, before we had dated. But the difference is that this time I had better questions to ask, and I
Mm.
understood things that I needed to look for and things I needed to hear. The last relationship that I had had where I'd been vetoed, it was important for me to hear that, they didn't veto people and that there was no couples privilege. So I was looking
Mm.
for someone that would say, like, we don't do hierarchy, we don't have couples privilege. And what I learned was it's actually far more valuable to me that if I'm dating someone that has other partnerships, that they say, well, the couple's privilege is inherent in our relationship structure. Here's where it is. Here's how I
Mm.
identify it. Here's how I've handled it in the past. Here's how I set boundaries with my nesting partners. Here's, it's,
Yep.
I'm looking for different answers. And instead of saying that it just doesn't exist, right? It's kind of like a white person saying, like, what? I have no white privilege. Like, um, um, it's more of just being able to identify, well, I do, this is what it looks like. And I feel like people who are willing to admit that they have that privilege are more susceptible, or not susceptible, but they're just more willing to listen when you say, hey, I'm throwing up a flag here. Like,
Right.
this hurts. Like, the things that you're saying and the things that you're doing hurts. And I think that they're more likely to believe you,
Yeah.
because
And be willing to
them
work with you.
exactly, like, them acknowledging that the privilege is there isn't going to destroy the idea they had about themselves and their relationship to begin with, and how ethical and morally sound it was. um
Hmm.
it doesn't disrupt their internal reality and how they view
Yeah.
themselves. And I think one of the big challenges was when I did start raising up flags like, oh, this is starting to sound a little racist, or this is starting to sound a lot like couples privilege before I'd gotten vetoed, it was, I think for those people that I was engaged with, they had an idea of how they treat people, and it was difficult for them to hear that me saying the opposite of what they had wanted to hear. And I was really fighting with this idea of like, well, it's not possible because, I was told like, well, this wasn't done because you're half black, or like things like that.
Right.
It's all of a sudden the excuses come out because your brain is really good at shielding you from
Mm,
facing things like that. Because it's painful to sit there and say like, I'm hurting someone that I care about,
yeah.
and so um, this relationship I have now, it's newer. So I don't have a lot of history to talk about, but I will say that I feel like the foundation that I've built with this person is solid and better than what I knew to build before. And so I feel like my skills at navigating those relationships have gotten better. And I'm not going to lie, I kind of hate saying it because, well, I mean, initially when I was vetoed, I really hated hearing about people like finding relationships after they'd been vetoed. But I will say that this is a relationship that has brought a lot of peace, I think, to just my
Mm,
inner being, um and I'm really happy about just. I think this person and I are on the same page as far as like setting boundaries
mhm.
and honoring each other and respecting each other, um and that has brought me a lot of joy. So it
Good.
has. It's
Oh,
it's
that makes
been.
me so happy.
Yeah, thank you.
You
Thank
deserve
you.
so
Yeah.
much joy.
Thank you for participating with that in me.
Yeah.
I mean, I've certainly taken some of your advice, like just the things that you share and stuff. You shared a post months ago about, oh, no, I can't remember it, of course, when I want to bring it up, but you had a post a long time ago that was really impactful for me, and I'm pretty sure it had something to do with jealousy. And oh, I know what it was. You had said, that there was a moment for you where you realized that like no one is you, like no one can replicate you. And so like,
Mm,
your partner choosing you, no one can replace you because there's no one like you. And I
yeah.
will say that post in particular has helped me a lot, even like actually just moving on from my veto and just being like going from a place where I didn't feel chosen, and then kind of looking at the idea of like, well, this is what chosen and healthy looks like, so that way I know what to look for in the future.
Yeah.
And choosing myself, right, like just, which
Yes.
which sounds nice, like to put, on like to sew into stuff, and
Right. Yeah. It's a
sounds
good
nice.
bumper
It's actually
sticker.
really hard. It can be very hard. I know that I'll leave off with a couple more points. I know I'm technically hitting my
Yeah, you're
time
fine.
limit. But okay. um, um, I remember maybe like 5 months after I'd been vetoed, I woke up in a cold sweat from a bad dream. And I have this image in my head of I felt like this person that had vetoed me had like discarded me. And I was still battling this idea that like it said something about my value as a person. And I woke up from this dream and I was processing it and journaling it, and I had this image kind of come to my mind of like a black trash can with black trash in it, and then on the top was a piece of gold. And the idea that I had from that and processing was that he didn't throw away trash. So I might feel discarded, and I do feel like I was just kind of tossed to the side,
Hmm.
but he didn't throw away trash. So because
Right.
it was like my inherent self-worth and just the fact that I have humanity that my value is worth like more than gold, right? It is I'm still
Yes.
valuable, like regardless of how people treat me. Um
Yes.
and what I took away from that was that for me, justice was healing the wound that was done to me on the inside, and that was something that I really had to own. And even though it didn't feel right in my body at the time, all the time, I kind of had to just drive the point home that I have worth and I am chosen. And my emotions didn't always feel that way, but I had to kind of actively correct my thinking.
You
I
gotta
had
hack your
to,
brain.
yes, I had to actively, when I had thoughts come up of I'm not worthy and I'm not lovable, or I'm not good enough. I had to remind myself, no, he didn't throw away trash. You were never trash to begin with, and the way someone treats you does not alter your self-worth, or your value. And the justice here is evening out those scales, bringing the healing back into yourself, so that way you can function from a place that's not of vengeance or pain, or and I had my moments where I really wanted to get these people back, and I chose not to. It was a very intentional choice on my end not to. And I decided to kind of let them go, quote unquote, in peace. I mean, I didn't really have an option technically. If I wanted to be a nuisance, I could have. But focusing on myself and restoring the justice within myself, it was really, honestly, was probably the most valuable thing I did, healing from that veto and walking away from it. So, um, yeah.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Oh, that makes me so happy because I've got to watch your process a bit,
You
and
did.
it's
Yeah.
so hard. It's so heartbreaking. And I love seeing you on the other side with your face lit up.
Yeah, and I have to be honest with you, I was not sure I was going to get here.
Yeah.
So there's been a lot of joy for me. I would say recently I've had a lot of people point out you seem better. You seem better. And I genuinely, it's not coming from a forced place. I genuinely feel better. I feel more regulated. I trust myself a lot more, because being vetoed made me feel oh, I should have caught that. And, how come I didn't prevent this from happening to me? And um, walking through the grieving process helped restore that trust within my own body and being able to trust my own reality and things a lot more. And so it's really, really validating for me to have people say, it's nice to see your face. You just look better.
Yeah.
Because it was really fucking hard. It's a lot of hard work. There were a lot of sleepless nights. I cried so much.
Yeah.
This was not easy. And I hate the idea of people thinking polyamorous relationships don't cost you something, or they're just flings or whatever.
Mm.
It's no, you are deeply entwined with the people that you engage with, and there is a lament when you lose them. So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story.
Yeah.
And there's so many, God, you just dropped so many pieces of wisdom and information that people can take with them.
Yeah.
uh, I think this is going to be another one of those uh, very highly listened to episodes.
My hope is honestly that if it just helps literally one person,
Mm,
that's I've just been vetoed. Where do I go from
yeah.
here? What do I even do? Honestly, it's worth it, because I feel like there is some kind of responsibility for those of us that have healed through things to kind of shine lights in dark places. So yeah, my hope for it is that it's a light in a dark place,
Mm,
and it gives people some sense of okay, this is kind of how I can begin to process. It'll be different for every person, but just some sense of a roadmap is kind of nice. And the hope that the grieving does come to an end. It doesn't feel like it initially, but eventually, if you listen to it, you sit with it, you let it be heard, it does run out eventually. So
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You get to the other end of it. Someone, I don't remember who it was. Someone said that emotions are like a tunnel that you're crawling through, right? And
Yeah.
you have to go through them to get to the other side.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
They emotions do not do very well being locked up and put away on a shelf, right? they are meant to be experienced and processed in healthy ways. To be experienced and to be processed. And I really think when you're dealing with things like sadness and anger and grief, like they just want to be heard. They want to be validated. The same way that
Yep.
you want closure, those emotions want closure. They want to be acknowledged and believed. Like they want to be believed that you're angry for a reason, you're hurt for a reason. And for me, it's helped viewing them as people, like, and giving them a humanity in my mind, and like visualizing myself sitting down with them and just listening, like, what do you have to say? For me, it's helped a lot. So
Good. Good. Thank you so much.
you're welcome. Thank you for having me. Thank you so
Of
much for hosting
course.
me.
Of course. Anytime. Thank you, Kyra Gilchrist, for being on the show again. If you want to hear the other episode that she was on, it was episode 9 of Nope, We're Not Monogamous. Have a great day. Bye.